Hey guys, I'm Saurav. Welcome to the channel. Today in this video, I am talking about long exposure. To be particular, I'm talking about mistakes in long exposure. Now, as a beginner, I used to make a lot of mistakes in long exposure photography, and I see a lot of people doing the same mistakes even now. In this video, I'm going to address those mistakes and I'm going to tell you how to fix them. I'm going to give you certain tips as well in order to improve your long exposure photography game. Wow, this was all in one take. Very excited for the video. So, without wasting any time, let's get started. The first mistake is not reaching the location in advance. When you're shooting long exposures or any kind of photos, when you reach a particular location, there are different vantage points that you need to explore before finalizing the shot. I like to reach the location before sunset so that I have enough time, I have enough light to explore the location, explore different compositions, and once I'm happy with the shot, that is when I set up my tripod for the long exposure shot. Once the golden hour is done and the blue hour starts kicking in, that's when I start shooting. And that brings me to my next point, shooting only in dark. When you're shooting light trails or low light long exposure photography, we wait for the scene to get dark. And that's understandable, right? Because you want the scene to get darker in order to use a slower shutter speed. The mistake I'm talking about is photographing long exposures only when it's pitch dark, after the blue hour. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. You can get great photos. But when you're shooting during blue hour, you have that last bit of atmospheric light that can level up your long exposure images. When I'm shooting long exposures, blue hour is my favorite time. I make sure that I have finalized my composition during blue hour and I'm making the most out of it. I wait for some more time, and once it gets completely dark, I'm usually done for the day. Next mistake, very important, is overexposed light trails. Now when you're photographing light trails, what is the most important part of the image? Light trails, right? So you want the details in the light trails. If they are overexposed, they are just white thick lines and you have to avoid them. The simple solution is to underexpose the image. If you don't want to change the shutter speed, try using a smaller aperture or ISO if possible. If you're shooting at the lowest ISO setting, you have to change the aperture. If you don't want to use a smaller aperture than the current setting, you have to use a slightly faster shutter speed. Make sure you take some sample images, and once you feel the exposure of the light trails are on point, then start shooting. The problem while underexposing the images for bright lights can be darker shadows, or when you're using a slower shutter speed, certain areas, like for example this building, can be overexposed. Doesn't look professional. That brings me to the next mistake, that is only taking a single exposure. Our camera's dynamic range is limited to capture all the details in highlights and shadows. What do we do in such situations? We use exposure bracketing. That's exactly what we are going to do now. I will reduce my shutter speed and take multiple images till I get all the details. You can use auto exposure bracketing as well, or you can reduce the shutter speed manually, whichever works for you, but make sure you're getting all the details in the images. Later, in post-processing, you just have to blend the lights. I'm using luminosity masks in order to do so. I will give a tutorial link in the description. Extra efforts, but this will separate your work from others out there. Next mistake is always using the slowest shutter speed possible. I will agree, I'm guilty of doing this mistake in the past, and even now I make these mistakes often. The way I used to set my camera setting is set my ISO to base ISO, set my aperture to f10 to f14, and use the slowest shutter speed possible. I used to think that slower the shutter speed, better will be the long exposure image. I could not be more wrong about it. Since long exposure is based on shutter speed, that's the main element of it. And if you're setting the shutter speed only on the amount of light available, you're not actually taking the whole freedom. If you're using aperture priority, it will do the same thing. So what's the point of using manual mode? A lot of times when photographing waterfalls, I used to go for a complete silky effect. But there were times where I liked images with slightly faster shutter speed, where the water was silky, but I could also see the texture of the flowing water. Moral of the story, don't set the shutter speed blindly. Experiment with different shutter speed. Use a faster shutter speed, use a slower shutter speed, then see what result you like and then start taking different compositions. This tip is going to be super helpful. It helped me a lot and I'm sure it will improve your work too. Next is not using the intervalometer. What is intervalometer? It's basically the time-lapse mode. Fancier name for the time-lapse mode. Not the videos one. The one where you take series of photos and you combine them in post to get a time-lapse. Intervalometer is a game changer for long exposure photography. Let me explain. You take an image, you like it, you either turn off the camera or you change the composition. Now, there are chances that just after that particular moment, you could have got a better shot with better light trails. Now, how to solve this problem? Use the time-lapse mode. I set my camera settings like I would for a normal long exposure image and I simply let my camera do the rest of the job. Later, I can go home, see the images and select the best out of the whole set. I can also combine lights from different images into a single image. I'm 100% sure when you start using this, you will realize how useful this is. Next time you plan to take long exposure images, make sure to remember these tips and I'm sure it will help you to improve your long exposure photography game. That's it from this video guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope this video was useful and if it was, press the like button. Didn't subscribe to the channel yet? Please subscribe. It helps to support my content, support my channel. I will talk to you guys in the next one. Bye.